Welcome to Talent Talks, brought to you by the 4A's and the 4A's Foundation, where we shine a spotlight on leaders who are actively demonstrating ways to create inclusive and equitable workplaces. I'm Cathy Butler, EVP of Talent, Equity, and Learning Solutions. On today's episode, we're chatting with Anthea Hoyle, Managing Director of United Minds. United Minds, part of the Weber Shandwick Collective, is a global management consultancy that specializes in transformation. Recently, United Minds published Employee Rising, a study that takes a 10-year-old look at the state of talent, how the employee experience has evolved, and what's standing out as pathways to create inclusive and equitable workplaces. Welcome, Anthea.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Anthea, can you share your background and tell us more about how United Minds helps clients with transformation?
Yeah, absolutely. So United Minds is a boutique consulting firm within the Weber Shandwick network. And we focus on organizational transformation. So essentially helping leaders and their employees through whatever time of change that may be, from leadership transitions to helping, leaders become more aligned, whether it's EVPs and employee experience, culture change, including diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as just change management across a number of different business changes, mergers, acquisitions, spin-offs, that sort of thing.
That is really exciting and important work. Can you tell me about the background on this study, how it was fielded, who participated, a little bit of the 10-year journey of how the interest began to where we are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So this latest study was done this year in 2024. And as you just mentioned, it is sort of a 10-year look at what we've coined Employees Rising. So 2014 was the first time that we did this study. And we did it basically because way back then, there was this notion that we were starting to identify where employees were having a bigger voice, and not just inside their companies, but also externally for the first time as social media became more of a real thing where people were posting, beyond just the initial Facebook taking off, there was more social media becoming active and available. So we sort of noticed this thing where employees were starting to comfortably talk externally about their workplaces, and started sort of talking more about what their likes and dislikes were. So that was the first time we did this study. And then we were interested just to sort of track over time how those expectations changed. So we repeated a version of the study across the last 10 years, with this most recent one, of course, being this year.
And in this particular year, was there something specific that you set out to understand, or were you looking for more kind of thematic evolution of the things that you had learned before?
Yeah, I guess it was more thematic, but we had assumed that we would find a bit of a change, given all of the things that we've all been through the last few years. We did do a study in 2021, actually. It wasn't necessarily an official part of the Employees Rising trajectory. It was specifically looking at the expectations of employees in the pandemic era. So we that was more around, I guess, the employee value proposition, people compact kind of thing. So we did sort of get some insights around that, which has helped us, of course, guide clients in this emerging era. But for this particular study, we sort of thought, well, previously you identified this notion of employees rising, so their voices becoming louder. Then after that, the next study identified employee activism, where people were speaking out more. Of course, at the moment, we all know how everything's a little bit polarized at the moment, and there's misinformation and disinformation externally. So we were sort of expecting there to be a continuation of that activism thread. So we were just, we didn't really have a strong hypothesis per se, but we just did expect more of that. So when this particular study came out and this notion of employee agency is what shone through, that was a little bit surprising for us.
Terrific. Well, we're going to come on to employee agency at length later on in the conversation. But just to set out the context of the study, it was global and it was across many industries. You want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we were mindful. We did really want to, the frontline workforce often gets overlooked. So we did want to make sure we include them. So it included employees across 14 different countries, covering the major continents, and did cover employees of all industries and kinds. So we do have subsets of data that we can look a little bit more into, for example, tech and healthcare. And it also made sure that we covered both private companies as well as publicly listed companies. And so we really did try and get a whole big, global view. And also we can look more closely at, particular cuts regionally or industry-wise.
Yeah. And one thing that stood out just right away of the study was general satisfaction, I'll say. Do you want to lean a little bit into that?
Yeah, so that was one of the things we were surprised at too, is that the big key takeaway from this whole report is that things are better than what we expected. So employees are actually more satisfied than in a long time. And then in 2014 and 2017, we repeated the study. So satisfaction and positive perceptions went up across the board, and there were some nice significant increases in that. So given the state of the world, I guess, we were surprised and happy to see that, and that employees were feeling more connected to their leaders and their workplaces.
Yeah, I found that just as an initial take on the study, it was just incredibly optimistic that employees are, I guess, loosely speaking, getting what they need in their workplaces. There was definitely some interesting findings around loyalty and longevity in their role, particularly given these last couple of years of turmoil. I found that really interesting. And given the study is broader than just the advertising industry, but that's certainly our focus area, is there anything that you thought was key to talk about relative to the advertising industry?
Um, yeah, well, I guess there's two aspects to that. So, one would be the key finding, which we haven't delved into deeply just yet, but the notion of employee agency that we
Hmm.
identified. So, employee agency being, um, that given the optimism, given the satisfaction, those things seem to be table stakes now, which is good. We're happy. A lot of organizations have made improvements. So, the one thing that employees are really looking for now is this sense of agency. So we define that as really people who feel like they can make an impact, they can contribute effectively, and then they feel valued for that. So obviously in advertising, which is an industry built on people having ideas and exchanging ideas and coming up with new solutions to sort of, create interest and demand for a client's brand or products, having people who have that sense of agency is of course going to be incredibly important for people in that industry. So that's one piece of it. The second piece we found is that um, just generally speaking, one of the findings was is that 40% of employees, despite all these things being good, 40% would still leave their job tomorrow if given the opportunity.
Hmm.
So we found that employees who have this sense of high agency are actually more likely to stay. So
Hmm.
that's also important. I know that historically, advertising agencies and communications agencies of all sorts do tend to struggle with retention, just given, the nature of the businesses. And so that might be of interest to leaders and ad agencies, especially just knowing that if you've got higher agency with your people, they're more likely to stay.
Yeah, that's perfect. It's a perfect segue into talking about employee agencies. I think leaders are looking for ways to foster the commitment to the company, given retention is important not just for business, but particular advertising agencies for clients as well, for them to feel that consistency. There are different dimensions in how you all define employee agency. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So just generally speaking, we defined it as people who have the ability to sort of independently make decisions, to feel a sense of autonomy and control over their work, the freedom and empowerment to make choices, and really know that they're contributing to their organization's goals and ultimately feeling valued for all of those things. So that's sort of how we define it. I mean, technically speaking, questions like I agree I'm making an impact and I feel valued were the sorts of questions that rose to the top for these
Mhm.
people.
Yeah, it sounds like employee agency and having that feeling, that fostering that is the future forward for talent and for workplaces. Because in many ways, it captures the ideals of what we all want out of our roles, out of our jobs, out of our companies. My interpretation is that leaders are providing frameworks for success, that they're being clear about goals, that they're being clear about how individuals can contribute, which feels on a day-to-day basis might be difficult to achieve. Yet at the same time, incredibly important as we think about equity in the workplace, creating systems that provide equal opportunity for everyone across the board. What's your take on that, on fostering employee agency so that we're improving equity in the workplace?
Yeah. So I would say a key part of if if a business has a culture where employees feel this sense of agency, then they're also going to be having greater levels of things like trust and again, comes back to that notion of feeling valued. If you feel like you can contribute, if you feel like you can speak up and have your ideas heard, there's got to be psychological safety and all of those incredible, important foundations. So if you have a company where people feel psychologically safe and they can speak up, then it is going to create an environment where equity can foster, because people can be more transparent, they can share concerns, they're more welcome to invite other opinions, more willing to sort of, just sort of, I guess, be open and inclusive and treat people more fairly across the board, because everyone feels confident and comfortable in their ability to contribute to the team. So I think it goes hand in hand with, there was the study I mentioned in 2021 we did, where the key finding was this sense of mutual commitment. So we tend to sort of think about employee agency and mutual commitment being two pieces that need to come together. And then together you definitely have much more equity within an organization.
Yeah, I think that mutual commitment also applies to client relationships as well. And so it's a little bit of a trifecta of agency, leadership, the individual, and also psychological safety within the client relationship and building a trusted relationship, but the mutual commitment to the same view of work, to the same view of work styles, how the teams function. Did you see or sense any of that coming through in your study relative to, I guess, the functions of team, multi-capability teams?
Not necessarily in this particular study. It's more looking at like individuals' perceptions and experiences on the state of workplaces. But I will say that in our 2021 study, which we looked more specifically at the employee experience. So that's where our notion of mutual commitment came through, because we found sort of like 4 key drivers of a good employee experience. And one was sort of like the table stakes thing, where it just has to be all of the hygiene factors. It's got to be fair. I got to feel like I'm being treated fairly, that, there's respect and all those sorts of things. The second piece was that there's purposeful work. And then the third piece being really that I understand that sort of notion of autonomy and flexibility. So this goes far beyond, like back in 2021, everyone was talking about remote work or hybrid work. And that's not what this piece of the puzzle means. That might be a component, but it's more about, again, this sense of agency. I feel autonomy over where and when and how I work. And then the last piece of this puzzle was this notion of what we create together. So the give and the get. So I think that really gets to the core of what you were asking about there, around this notion that, everyone's contributing and everyone is both a participant and a receiver of this culture that we create together.
Yeah, that's terrific. And I'm fascinated by this concept. Clearly, we're having a long discussion about it, and even in our prep sessions. What are some things that leaders should be thinking about if they are within an organization where they could foster more employee agency, but maybe don't know where to start or how to continue? What are some things that we can walk away with from a tool set standpoint?
Yeah, sure. I think, there are different aspects to it. And in our report, we sort of dive into this. So are you looking to, sometimes it's helpful to look at what is the business need or the talent need that's going to help drive this. So is it more about increasing satisfaction? Or is it about increasing productivity? Is it about retention? So there's different things that address those different pieces of the puzzle. But essentially, I think it comes down to understanding what your particular employees need. So our study is a helpful starting off point, but I think then it's important to be, listening to and speaking to your own people and really listening to what does agency look like to them. So do they currently feel like they've got the ability to contribute? And if not, why not? And how else would they like that to show up? And are they also, feeling valued and in the right ways? So recognition, rewards, the culture of people giving credit to each other, that sort of thing. So I think leaders, part of the challenge is really just being able to take these ideas and sentiments and then using that as a guide to really understand the needs of your particular team and then listening to that. But ultimately, at the end of the day is, do your people see the connection between what they're doing every day and the outcome of that? And do they feel like people are thankful they're there to do it? So
yeah, I love that so much. And My takeaway, what you said is, it's important for leaders to look at both quant and qual data and thinking about and hearing what their employees need. Quant, I'm a huge fan of employee engagement surveys twice a year, pulse check, just to see how data is trending year over year. But equally important, and I'm also a big fan of having coffees with your employees, a couple folks every week, just to, I think, stay close to the individuals who are really committed to the company, or maybe you're going to hear something from a coffee that you wouldn't hear in a quant survey. And I think as leaders, we tend to be really busy with, crazy calendars and things like that, but it's important to make time to listen, not just once a year, but on an ongoing basis, just to stay connected on that. That also fosters trust, engagement, commitment, and gives great opportunity for upcoming leaders to talk to the leaders of the agency, maybe get some questions asked as well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think we all know the old saying, people don't quit jobs, they quit bosses.
Yes.
So the more that elite leaders can create those personal bonds and connections and sort of navigate each individual's needs on their teams with the collective goal of their team, that, to your point, comes through conversations, not just the physical statistical data.
Yeah, absolutely. It also helps foster the inclusivity in an
Yeah.
organization where every individual feels that they can be heard and seen, particularly by leadership. And that's important to make sure that we're thinking about all the time, as well as, systemic practices as we build more equity in all of our workplaces. One of the things that I think stood out in the study was the idea that agency is a theme to be looking out for the future. You're seeing lots of evidence of that now, but we can continue to look at that, build it, and then foster it moving forward. Were there other themes that you think agency leaders should be paying close attention to that maybe have dropped off in your studies, or are maybe perking up in a way that you're not quite sure how they're going to go?
Sure. Yeah, I think, well, just generally speaking, the things that have gone down, I guess. So everything, all the good experiences have gone up, but employees today, like I said earlier, are less likely to stay long term. That's probably just an indicator of the times we're in and the way that people have redefined their relationships with employers. But it's good that people are aware of that and are mindful of, is the likelihood of their own people more likely than the average to leave, and other reasons for that. The other thing is, we've noticed that employees' willingness to advocate on behalf of their employers has also gone down. So in
Mm.
previous years, people may have been more likely to say, hey, come work here, it's a great place to work, or you should buy our products or services. Obviously, for advertising agencies, people may not be as likely to be talking out about, hey, come use our services. Um, but that's also just something to be aware of, I guess, also in the context of the clients they work with. And if they're working with clients who have products or brands where employees could speak out on behalf of them, just being aware that, I think, years ago, it became a little bit popular to maybe include employees' voices in marketing communications. And maybe now that's not as appropriate because employees just aren't as willing. And it may not be because they don't like their employer. I think it's just a new trend. Employees maybe just don't want to speak out. So those, I think, are some of the main things. Of course, Gen Zs are becoming more prominent in the workforce, and so they've got their perceptions. It's actually not that different from the general findings across what we found across the study. So there's more commonalities between generations than not. And the last thing I'll say is that this is a perennial problem, but middle managers continue to be, one of the overlooked demographics inside organizations. They've got some of the biggest pressures from above and from below, and yet they are, not necessarily given the support and resources they need. So really looking at, and of course, they're the key to, widespread engagement across the organization. So paying more attention to your middle managers will be important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think we've talked about it before as the concrete middle, that they are feeling the pressure from both the top and the bottom of their organization, or the lower levels of their organization. Yet historically, they are the most underinvested in from a time and resources standpoint, but they are the future leaders of any organization. And leaders should pay attention to them and really think through how they can continue to support and create this next generation of leadership. Otherwise, when they get into their next levels, they may not be fully equipped as much as we want them to be. So I think that's a topic for certainly another discussion, and the need to really think about this middle layer within all of our companies. But just as we wrap up our discussion here, one key question I want to ask is, what would you like to see show up in the study in 2034, 10 years from now?
It's a great question. Well, since we had such positive results this time, I'd like to see that continue. So I'd like to see that the hard work, that leaders and communicators and HR professionals have done the last 10 years to improve workplaces continues. But as expectations continue to change, obviously how we do that's going to change. So this notion of agency, I'd like to see show up more, which is ultimately at the end of the day, I think, the reason I think it's a focus now is because we have covered off on so many of those basic foundational needs. So I'd like to see that come out more, that more companies have actually leaned into that and made it possible, that they've leaned into that notion of mutual commitment as well. Because if we see those two things coming through, I think organizations across all industries, including ones like advertising businesses, which is hugely dependent upon people being at their best every day, we're just going to have so many more businesses ready to help solve some of the big problems that we all need to be working on together. So we sort of coined that at United Minds. We call that, agency plus mutual commitment equals a people-powered business. So I think we'd like to see that show up.
Yeah, I love that. A people-powered business, certainly resonant with kind of what's happening in the world at large at the moment. Last question, from your experience working with clients, how can agency leaders continue to foster equity in the workplace?
Yeah, I think basically we can never put it sort of at the back of our minds. I think we have to actively, consciously always be thinking about it. I mean, as humans, it's our default to always refer to our own experiences or our own biases. And I think just trying to sometimes strip away the complexity of how we're supposed to think about these things and just realize that at the end of the day, like, if you're trying to consciously always be aware of everyone's needs and considering that in the context of what the business is trying to achieve and what all of your talent needs, and trying to also just remember to ask people things, talk to people, listen to people, factor that in, and always be thinking about whether it's a brief for a piece of work and being really thoughtful about who are the audiences for that piece of work, and always being mindful of factoring in these things through to when you're running your own business and it's time to think about L&D programs or how you're doing performance management or competencies and behaviors, whatever it is, always trying to think about like all aspects of where are people coming from? Do people have the resources they need? Are we making assumptions? Are our expectations consistent and fair? And are we thinking about people's abilities and experiences and backgrounds across the spectrum of things? So sometimes I think also with equity and diversity and inclusion, people think they're doing a really good job by remembering to factor in one or two different types of groups, but there's also like learning differences and all sorts of things. So I think it's just that notion of constant curiosity, awareness, and care. Like you want to try and make things better and more effective for everybody. And of course, great work comes out of that. So
yeah. Thank you for that. I love that answer so much. Constant curiosity and care. And also thinking about systemic practices that we can put into place for all. And that to me is just really the embodiment of equity and inclusion. So thank you very much for the conversation today. I am really excited to now really officially relaunch Talent Talk. So thank you for being the very first guest of that. Talent Talks is brought to you by 4A's and the 4A's Foundation. Tune in next month to hear from leaders who are focused on creating inclusive and equitable workplaces. Thank you, Anthea.
Thank you.